Bible Alive John, the wedding in Galilee, a wedding in Galilee. The following presentation would be impossible without these resources. So Rosalinda, this is where we get the material from, especially these three resources. And I can provide you with a bibliography if you, which is long overdue for some of you. I always put it on the video, This Bible Alive series is about becoming considerate Bible readers to our Middle Eastern ancestors in the faith. Offering a social science commentary on the gospel called John. Presenting an historically sensitive cross-cultural comparative set of lenses from which to hear or to read the gospel called John as its original audience did. Attempting to interpret John in a way that would be fair to its original author and audience. Maintaining interest and attention on important features in our own Western modern world. Let's begin. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine failed, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now 6 stone jars were standing there for the Judean rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the steward of the feast." So they took it. When the steward of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who drew the water knew, the steward of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when all have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed into him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples. And there, they stayed for a few days. Let's look again at the structure of the gospel called John. We can divide it into 5 parts. The first part is the prologue, the hymn of the Logos, a poem about the Messiah's cosmic status, the first 18 verses of the first chapter. Everything that the author John wants to tell his audience is contained in those 18 verses. Everything after those 18 verses is rehash. Chapter 2, or part 2, is the book of signs, which is a set of adventures of Jesus revealing himself and God to Israel. Goes from chapter 1, verse 19, to chapter 12, verse 50. The section highlighted in red, from Cana to Cana, is what we're going to be dealing with today and in the classes that follow in the next few weeks. The third part of the gospel called John is the book of glory, which is chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 20, verse 31, which was the original ending of this gospel. The original version of this gospel ended with chapter 20, verse 31. There was no chapter 21. The book of glory is the washing of the feet of the disciples, the farewell dinner, the passion and post-resurrection appearances, finally with Thomas, put your hand into my side, and so forth. But then the author, the beloved disciple, died, and his community was in jeopardy of collapsing. So the community thought best it was needed to write an appendix, an epilogue, the group attesting to the author's veracity, which is chapter 21. Finally, there is a strange and wonderful insertion that was put into the text at even a later date than chapter 21. It's a wonderful story about a woman caught in adultery and Jesus rescuing her. This story, in its vocabulary and theological outlook, is completely foreign to the Gospel of John. But somebody in the 2nd century said, this story is too good to lose. We got to stick it somewhere. So they shoehorned it into John. And it's been there ever since. It doesn't belong, but it's wonderful. In these Bible Lives, we'll deal with that story last. From Cana to Cana, John chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 4, verse 54. Catholics love the story because we're Marian, right? So we love the story of the wedding at Cana. But we forget that it's just one little part of a greater section in the Gospel of John. The greater section being the book of signs, which goes all the way to chapter 13, from chapter 1, verse 19. And also a literary section that's from chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 4, verse 54. The Cana to Cana section. Or the Galilee to Jerusalem, back to Galilee section. The words that open the account of the first Cana marvel, the wedding at Cana, the provision of wine, and on the third day, that's what it begins in chapter 2, verse 1, and on the third day, indicate that the theme that mark John chapter 1, verse 19 to 51, a theme of days, are coming to a conclusion. If you read John chapter 1 from the first verse, and you read on to John chapter 1, verse 51, right before the wedding at Cana, you'll be intrigued if you read it very carefully, because you see it starts in the beginning was the word. So in the beginning. In the beginning. Where did I hear that in the Bible? In the beginning. Genesis, right? The creation myth in Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning. And then you have a set of days, right? Well, the same thing with John chapter 1. John chapter 1 begins in the beginning, and then you go a few verses down the road, and it says the next day. What was the first day? Well, that must have began in the beginning. And then it goes a few more verses, and you got the next day. So you've got 3 days right there. Then it goes the next day, and it implies another day. And then it says on the third day. So what you're getting is a kind of a mystical week in John, which we're going to look at momentarily. A lot of people miss this because, they're not looking for it. You kind of got to get tuned to it. Third day. In Israelite thought, the third day is the day where God manifests God's self, like at Mount Sinai with Moses. Exodus chapter 19, verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there were peals of thunder and lightning and a heavy cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people of the camp trembled. Later in John chapter 4, so the wedding at Cana marvel story begins on the third day. There was a wedding at Cana. Oh, what does that tell us? That tells us God's glory is going to be revealed. See that? Later, in John chapter 4, verses 43 to 54, Jesus returns to Cana in Galilee and performs another wonder, his second sign. As we will eventually see, John, the author, goes to considerable lengths to link the second Cana marvel with the story of Jesus' first sign in his first visit to Cana. John chapter 4, verse 46. Then he, Jesus, came back to Cana in Galilee, where he had changed the water into wine. The author has to remind us of that, because the author wants us to link the two Cana marvels. Meaning, if you're going to understand the wedding at Cana story, you have to understand the second Cana marvel story and everything that is in between. This is another reason why biblical proof texting sucks. Don't do that, because you're ripping texts, little verses, out of the narrative whole, which has a whole symbolism going on. A number of structural elements in chapter 4, verse 43 to 54, the second Cana story, are matched in the wedding at Cana story in chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. As the second sign story closes, the narrator comments, John 4:54. Now this was the second sign. Hey, readers, hearers, this is the second sign Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. Taken together, these comments single out a new stage in the unfolding of the gospel as a whole. It reports a journey from Cana to Cana. Indeed, a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, back to Galilee. And what that gives us is an Oreo cookie structure. And I want you to think of this section in the weeks to come. Believe me, you won't get it out of your head because I'm going to pound it in. Oreo cookie section of the Gospel of John. You can think of the Galilee to Jerusalem, then back to Galilee section that we're reading in John as something like an Oreo cookie. Once this literary frame between the two Cana stories gets recognized as two cookies, top and bottom, in the sandwich, the reported encounters that make up the white filling assume an identifiable role in the author's point of view. In other words, all the white filling, or all the little encounters Jesus has with people, they get contextualized between the two, top chocolate sandwich cookie, bottom chocolate sandwich cookie, which are the two Cana marvels. Understand? This is how you understand. The author is showing us how you understand them. How you understand them. Now, the thing is, you can't get this at Mass, because at Mass, are you going to read that big section of text? No. And Mass is not a Bible study. Okay? Now, the filling. Let's look at this. The filling. One moves systematically through episodes that report meetings between the Johannine Jesus and others. Jesus and the Judeans meet in the purification of the temple, following the wedding at Cana. After that, there is a comment from the narrator in chapter 2, verse 23 to 25. And Jesus then meets two other figures from the world of Israel, Nicodemus, followed by John the Dunker. Then Jesus next moves into a world that is geographically and spiritually beyond the boundaries of the Judeans. In the absence of his disciples, he has two moments of an encounter with a Samaritan woman at a well. Then the disciples return, and that allows Jesus to comment on the events that are going on around the unwitting disciples. And these episodes conclude with Jesus' reception by the Samaritan villagers. That's the white filling, folks. Each of these encounters between Jesus and others, between Jesus and Judeans, and between Jesus and non-Judeans, tells of Jesus' self-revelation and the response of others to that self-revelation. On two occasions, the Johannine narrative slows down, and the narrator comments in chapter 2, verse 23 to 25, and then Jesus comments in chapter 4, verse 31 to 38. They comment on the surrounding events. This overview of John chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 4, verse 54 suggests that the section entitled Cana to Cana, or better, Jesus began bringing life to Israel from Galilee to Jerusalem and back again. May be structured in the following fashion. What's in bold, 1 and 2, are the 2 chocolate cookies. What makes the Oreo is the filling, A through H. Do y'all understand that? That is how you are to read those stories. Does that make sense? So how do we understand what he wants to tell us? We have to understand what is the theme of this Oreo cookie. Or we can sit around going, I know what it means to me. What does it mean to you? What does it make you feel? Well, it makes me feel like, I loved how Jesus did the water into wine. He's always compassionate. Okay, what did it mean to you? Well, it means, we can all do that. That's kind of kumbaya-ish. Or we can do this. Let me tell you what it means. It means every doctrine and devotion in the Catholic Church is absolutely true, and I'll make all of these texts into a connect the dots that prove our tradition is superior and everybody else's is inferior. Neither of these two ways of doing it, umpire number 1 is the latter, umpire number 2 is the former, are Bible study. Bible study is you have to grapple, okay? Let's be honest to our biblical ancestor in the faith named John, the author of the 4th gospel. All right, you enjoying this?
Yeah.
Wonderful. This Oreo cookie scheme shows the literary frame created by the use of the 2 Cana stories and the careful assembly of the intervening material. Encounters between Jesus and characters from Israel follow the first Cana wonder. Notice I'm not calling them miracles. Wonder, marvel, signs. And parallel encounters between Jesus and characters from Samaria lead into the second Cana marvel. The 2 comments, one from the narrator following the encounter between Jesus and the Judeans, and the other before the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan villagers, are also systematically, by the author, placed into the narrative to help his audience get the meaning he intends. The action of the narrative is framed by the movement of characters in the story. In the case of the wedding at Cana, it's Jesus, his mother, and the disciples. In verse 12, Jesus' brothers join the movement. They're going to appear later on in the story in chapter 7, verses 1 to 10. More on them later. Finally, the narrator comments on the significance of the event in John chapter 2, verse 11. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his doxa, his glory. And his disciples believed into him. A translation in. We know in John it's into, right? In-group adherence. We're going to talk a lot about what those three things are, right? Signs. We're going to talk about what signs mean in the weeks to come. Glory, and how that relates to honor-shame language in the Mediterranean world of Jesus. And believed into. The story of the wedding at Cana has the following shape. Verses 1 to 2 give us the time. They establish the time, the place, and the reason for the eklethe, the gathering of named characters. The mother of Jesus, Jesus, the disciples. They all get established there. They are eke in Greek, there. Verses 3 to 5, the mother of Jesus speaks to Jesus and responds to his rebuke by telling the attendants to do whatever he tells them. Verses 6 through 10, the main action of the story. Filling the jars, the steward recognition of the good wine, his reaction to the words of the bridegroom, all get triggered by Jesus speaking to the servants who do what he tells them. Verse 11, the narrator comments on the manifestation of the doxa, the glory of Jesus, and the faith of the disciples. And finally, verse 12 gives us a close to the account of the wedding at Cana story on the characters from chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, who have made the eklethe, the journey and gathering, to be eke there at Cana. Now they move away, katabe, to be in another there, in another place, eke, which is at Capernaum. In John's gospel, Jesus' so-called public ministry is the story of how he brought life and light to Israel through his self-disclosure. That's different than the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The major events of this Johannine story take place at celebrations and or feasts that were full of feeling for first century Israelites. Much like we have feeling for birthdays, funerals, Christmas time, 4th of July, weddings. The author of John notes how Jesus initiates his self-disclosure at a wedding at Cana in Galilee. The series of self-disclosures called signs in the book of signs comes to a close with a funeral of his best friend Lazarus in Judea. In between, there is a series of Israelite feasts that punctuate Jesus' self-disclosure to Israel. Events such as weddings, funerals, and feasts are special times that mark off high points in human living. Everyday living, on the other hand, follows clock time. When you're in everyday living, you say, how much time do I have left? How much time before Spider-Man begins? How much time do I have to wait before Twin Peaks starts again on Sunday? My favorite of all. But when you say, is it time? Or you say, Merry Christmas, Happy Birthday. Now we're in special time, right? All right. That's the difference between clock time and special time. In Hellenistic Greek, special time, which means qualitatively significant time, where we stand up from time into now, is called Kairos. Kairos. While regular clock time is called Chronos. Chronos. So Greeks had two words for this. What were you going to say?
That's where we get the word chronological.
That's where we get the word chronological. The Johannine Jesus calls his own special, qualitatively significant kairotic time his hour. What does this have to do with you or me, woman? My hour, my ora, has not come. And that's a very ominous statement. We're going to see that again and again and again. They tried to arrest him, but his hour had not yet come. Yes, Rose.
If this is his first sign, how did his mother know that he was able to perform this?
Let's stick a pin in it. We'll get to that. Yeah, let's stick a pin in it. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that one. Can we go ahead? What were we going to say, sir?
What origin is Kairos and Chronos?
Greek.
Greek?
Greek.
Greek.
The Greeks were pretty clever, and Mediterraneans in general were very clever. They had a way of understanding. We are, in our time, we have so little meaning in our world. It's just Chronos. As evidenced by people even in Bible life. The author of the gospel called John places special times, kairotic times, of Jesus' self-presentation and revelatory activity within the framework of the special kairotic times of Israel, the feasts of Israel. These later times include both domestic special times, domestic kairos, such as weddings and funerals, the wedding at Cana and the funeral of Lazarus, and political special times, political kairos, such as pilgrimage to the temple for Passover and the Feast of Booths. To appreciate what the author is doing, it helps if a reader, a Bible reader, can understand the emotions Israelites felt during these special kairotic times. Emotions such as those modern United States readers feel for birthdays, anniversaries, or Christmas. As a high context document written in anti-language for an anti-society, which is what John's community was, such feelings evoked by domestic and political festive times are presumed by the author. He expects you, the reader, to know. He's not writing for Americans. So we have to do double work with John. That's what that comparative set of lenses I talked about in what this study's about is for. I got to give you the cultural background. This feature further underscores the interpersonal dimensions of the Johannine Gospel. Remember, it's not about communicating ideas so much as it's about emotionally further bonding the community of this gospel together. So I talked to you about that week, right? So let me show you what I'm talking about here. If you're reading the Gospel of John carefully, right, it starts off in the beginning, en arche en hologos. In the beginning was the Word. En arche, in the beginning. That sounds like Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning created God the sky vaults and the earth. That's the first line of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning. And we remember back in Genesis that began a series of days. Same thing with John. So if we read from John chapter 1 verse 1 John chapter 1 verse 1 through verse 28, we don't have any time transitions except in the beginning. So chapter 1 verse 1 to verse 28 constitutes a day, because when we reach verse 29, it says the next day. So that would be day 2, the second day. Then the story continues and we get to verse 35 and it says the next day. That would be the third day. Y'all follow that? That continues for a fourth day and an implied fifth day in verses 40 through 42 and verses 43 through 51. Then when we go from chapter 1 to chapter 2, something gets very interesting. It says, on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana, right? Add up the days and you get 8 days. 8 means a new creation, the first day of a new week of creation. Creation is being renewed in Jesus, Messiah. The Lamb of God, right? Isn't that what John the Dunker identified him as? The Lamb of God? We know what Mediterranean sky lore said about that lamb. What was that ram, that cosmic ram, supposed to do? Completely reorient and renew creation. That's why he's got 8 days. Let's pause right there.